The Galactic Defense Coalition had seen many species join their ranks over the millennia. The proud Vorthok with their plasma cannons that could melt asteroids, the calculating Nexari, who treated warfare like a particularly violent chess match, the hulking Grenderites, who considered anything smaller than a moon to be personal combat. Each species brought their own flavor of controlled violence to the table, and the coalition had grown quite comfortable in their assumption that military prowess followed a predictable pattern across the galaxy. Then humanity submitted their application. The coalition's military assessment committee had reviewed thousands of species over the centuries, and they developed what they considered a foolproof evaluation system. Advanced weapons technology. Check the plasma output ratios. Tactical sophistication. Analyze their largest military engagements. Strategic thinking. Review their conquest records. It was all very scientific, very thorough, and very, very wrong when it came to the bipedal mammals from the third rock orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. Admiral Korvex of the Vorthok Navy had been particularly amused by humanity's military records. "Look at this," he'd announced to the assessment chamber, his four arms gesturing dramatically at the holographic displays. "They still use projectile weapons that fire metal slugs. Metal slugs. My hatchlings play with more sophisticated armaments." The chamber had erupted in what passed for laughter among 14 different species, a cacophony of clicks, warbles, and harmonic resonances that somehow conveyed universal amusement. General Thys, whose species had evolved from apex predators on a world where the gravity was 3 times Earth normal, had been equally dismissive. Their largest conflicts involved barely 100 million individuals across their entire planet. "We've seen border skirmishes with higher casualty rates." The Nexari representative had calculated that humanity's total military losses throughout their recorded history wouldn't even register as a noteworthy engagement by galactic standards. But the coalition needed warm bodies for the upcoming crisis, and humanity had certainly provided those in abundance. 4 billion volunteers, which was either impressively enthusiastic or desperately naive. Probably both. The Species Evaluation Committee had shrugged their various appendages and rubber-stamped the application. After all, cannon fodder didn't need to be particularly clever. Which brought them to the current situation, the Confederation's first joint military briefing with their newest members. The crisis was real enough. The Devourer fleet had emerged from dark space 6 months ahead of schedule, and their biomechanical monstrosities were already consuming entire star systems in the outer rim. Every species in the coalition had committed their finest military minds to developing a response strategy, because the alternative was becoming organic components in an ever-expanding cosmic horror show. The human representative had arrived precisely on time, which was either refreshingly punctual or suspiciously overprepared. She was unremarkable by most galactic standards. Average height for her species, standard-issue Terran military uniform, and an expression that suggested she was paying attention to something entirely different from whatever was happening in the room. Her credentials were equally underwhelming, a background in something called logistics coordination, and a service record that was notably devoid of any actual combat experience. Commander Vextar of the Nexari had reviewed her file 3 times, convinced there must be some error. "Excuse me," he'd interrupted the initial introductions, his translucent features shifting to display polite confusion, "but I believe there's been some mistake with your representative's qualifications. According to these records, she's never actually commanded troops in battle." The human had smiled in response, which was apparently their species' way of indicating either amusement or mild irritation. The xenopsychology reports were frustratingly unclear on the distinction. "That's correct," she'd replied in perfectly translated galactic stand. "I specialize in getting people from where they are to where they need to be." The assembled military leaders had exchanged glances that conveyed volumes about their expectations for human contributions to galactic warfare. Transportation logistics, personnel management. These were the concerns of supply clerks and bureaucrats, not military strategists facing an existential threat to all organic life in the galaxy. Admiral Korvex had attempted to salvage the situation with typical Vorthok direct. "Perhaps your species has some advanced defensive technologies we haven't yet assessed, some hidden capabilities that weren't included in your initial application." "Oh, we're terrible at defense," the human had replied with that same ambiguous smile. absolutely hopeless at it. We prefer to be somewhere else entirely when things get violent. The silence that followed could have been measured in geological ages. Here was a species facing the most destructive force the galaxy had ever encountered, and their representative was casually admitting to a preference for running away. It was simultaneously pathetic and refreshingly honest, though the assembled military minds were leaning heavily toward pathetic. General Thys had cleared his throat, which produced a sound like grinding tectonic plates. I see. Well, perhaps we should proceed with the strategic overview. The Devourer fleet is currently 3 systems out from the Nexari border worlds, moving at approximately. He'd paused, consulting his tactical display. They'll reach Coalition space in 14 standard days. The human had nodded thoughtfully, as if this timeline was merely an interesting piece of information rather than a countdown to potential galactic extinction. She'd made some notes on a primitive data pad, actual physical notes, with a stylus, like some kind of medieval scholar, and then had asked the question that would later be remembered as either profound insight or spectacular naivety. When you say they'll be here in 14 days, do you mean they'll be here, or just the advanced scouts? The distinction had seemed irrelevant to the assembled military experts. The Devourers operated as a unified swarm consciousness. Advanced scouts, main fleet, it was all the same organism spread across space like a malignant constellation. The entire fleet moves as one entity, Commander Vexstar had explained patiently, as if addressing a particularly slow cadet. There are no advance elements or rear guard formations. They consume everything in their path simultaneously. Ah, the human had said, making another note. That's actually quite helpful. And then just as General Thys began outlining the Coalition's defensive strategies, she'd stood up, gathered her primitive datapad, and headed for the exit. Where are you going? Admiral Corvex had demanded, his 4 arms bristling with indignation. The human had paused at the doorway, that mysterious smile flickering across her features one more time. Home, she'd replied simply. We have a lot of people to move. The door had sealed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving the galaxy's finest military minds staring at empty space and wondering if humanity had just proved every assumption about their cowardice absolutely correct. The human had been gone for exactly 47 minutes when the Coalition's monitoring stations began registering what could generously be described as organized chaos across the entire Terran sector. If one were feeling less generous, it looked like the most spectacular military panic attack in recorded galactic history. Within the first hour, every major population center on Earth was mobilizing simultaneously. Space elevators that normally operated on carefully scheduled maintenance cycles were suddenly running at maximum capacity around the clock. Orbital shipyards that had been producing civilian transport vessels abruptly shifted to something that looked suspiciously like military logistics support. Though admittedly it was hard to tell the difference when humans were involved, their civilian and military technologies were so quaint that the distinction seemed largely philosophical. Admiral Corvex had been monitoring the situation from his flagship, mostly for entertainment value. They're evacuating their entire homeworld, he announced to his tactical staff, his primary arms gesturing at the holographic displays with obvious amusement. Look at this. They're launching every functional spacecraft they have. Cargo haulers, passenger liners, even what appears to be repurposed recreational vehicles. The spectacle was indeed magnificent in its apparent desperation. Humanity's space fleet, such as it was, consisted mainly of vessels that other species would have relegated to system maintenance duties decades ago. Fusion-powered cargo haulers that moved with all the grace and speed of pregnant whales. Passenger transports that could barely manage interplanetary distances without major mechanical interventions. Survey ships held together with what appeared to be industrial-grade optimism and spare parts. Commander Vexstar, monitoring from the Nexari observation post, had calculated the logistics with his species' typical mathematical precision. At current evacuation rates, they'll have moved approximately 12% of their population off-world before the Devourers arrive. The remaining 88% will be. He'd paused, his translucent features shifting to display something resembling sympathy. Well, let's just say they'll become part of the Devourer fleet's biomass reserve. What made the whole display even more pathetically endearing was how badly organized it appeared to be. Human vessels were launching from Earth towards seemingly random destinations throughout their local stellar neighborhood. Some headed for their minimal colonies on nearby worlds, Mars, Europa, a few asteroid mining stations that barely qualified as permanent settlements. Others struck out for deep space with apparent destinations that existed only in their navigation computers. General Thiss had observed the exodus with the sort of grim fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. They're scattering like prey animals, he'd reported to Coalition Command. No coordinated defensive positions, no strategic fallback points, just pure panic flight response. It's actually rather sad. The human colony worlds were responding with equal fervor, launching their own evacuation fleets toward destinations that made even less sense than Earth's diaspora. The mining colonies in the asteroid belt simply abandoned their installations entirely, loading every available person onto vessels that looked like they'd been designed by engineers who'd heard rumors about spacecraft but had never actually seen one. The agricultural settlements on the outer moons packed up with an efficiency that would have been admirable if it wasn't so obviously pointless. Where exactly did they think they could run where the Devourers wouldn't eventually find? But perhaps the most telling detail was the human military's response, or rather their complete lack of one. While every other coalition species was mobilizing battle fleets and establishing defensive perimeters, humanity's armed forces seemed to be functioning primarily as traffic control for the largest refugee crisis in their species' history. Their warships, and the term required significant generosity when applied to humanity's military vessels, were being loaded with civilians and supplies rather than weapons and tactical equipment. Commander Vextar had run the calculations 3 times before believing the result. Their military evacuation protocols are consuming 100% of their available resources, he'd reported to the Coalition Assessment Committee. 0% allocation to defensive operations, 0% to offensive capability. They're literally abandoning any pretense of military resistance. The Galactic military observers had watched this display with a mixture of professional interest and species-wide embarrassment. It was one thing to be strategically outmatched by a cosmic horror like the Devourer fleet. That was an understandable response from a primitive civilization. But humanity's complete abandonment of even token resistance efforts suggested a level of cowardice that made their inclusion in the coalition seem like a cosmic joke. Admiral Corvex had summed up the prevailing sentiment during the daily briefing. I've seen prey species with more fighting spirit. At least most civilizations attempt some kind of last stand before fleeing. Humans appear to have skipped directly to the fleeing part. The evacuation itself followed patterns that defied every established principle of military logistics. Instead of consolidating population centers for more efficient transport, humans were dispersing from every possible location simultaneously. Rather than establishing secure staging areas for refugee processing, they seemed to be launching vessels as quickly as they could be loaded, regardless of destination or supply status. Their transportation priority algorithms appeared to have been designed by a committee of statisticians, having a collective nervous breakdown. Even more baffling was their destination selection. Coalition tracking stations identified human vessels heading for uninhabited systems, planets with barely breathable atmospheres, and even areas of space that contained nothing but cosmic dust and gravitational anomalies. It was as if they were intentionally spreading themselves across the least strategically defensible positions possible. They're making themselves into the most scattered target in galactic history, General Thiss had observed with something approaching admiration for the sheer audacity of such tactical incompetence. The Devourers will have to spend centuries tracking down every last refugee, which, the assembled military experts agreed, was probably the point. Humanity had apparently decided that their best military strategy was to make their complete conquest as time-consuming and inconvenient as possible. It was the military equivalent of making yourself too annoying to bother with, which was either brilliant in its simplicity or simple in its complete absence of brilliance. The evacuation continued for 6 days, during which time humanity managed to disperse roughly half their total population across approximately 300 different locations throughout their local galactic region. The logistics alone should have been impossible for a species with their limited technological capability, but somehow they'd managed to coordinate the largest refugee operation in recorded history, using nothing but determination and what appeared to be an inexplicable talent for organized pandemonium. And through it all, their original representative remained conspicuously absent from all coalition communications, presumably somewhere in the chaos coordinating the most elaborate retreat in military history. The galaxy's finest military minds continued to observe, calculate and quietly marvel at humanity's capacity for spectacular strategic failure, completely unaware that they were witnessing the opening movements of the most sophisticated military operation ever conceived.
It was Lieutenant Yexel of the Nexari Deep Analysis Division.
who first noticed something peculiar about humanity's chaotic exodus, though it took her 3 days of staring at holographic star charts before the anomaly registered in her mathematically oriented mind. Yexil specialized in pattern recognition across large datasets, a skill that had proven invaluable in tracking enemy fleet movements during the Galactic Wars. Her species evolved to see mathematical relationships the way other civilizations saw colors, and what she was seeing in the human evacuation data was starting to give her the cognitive equivalent of a migraine. "Commander Vexstar," she announced during the daily intelligence briefing, her translucent features shifting to display careful uncertainty. "I need to report a statistical irregularity in the Terran dispersal patterns." The assembled officers turned their attention to her analysis, with the polite interest typically reserved for junior staff members who'd discovered something interesting but probably irrelevant. Yexil activated her presentation display, flooding the briefing room with three-dimensional projections of human vessel trajectories across local space. "At first glance, their evacuation appears random," she continued, her voice carrying the slight harmonic resonance that indicated deep concentration. "However, when I overlay their flight paths with gravitational field mappings, stellar drift calculations, and temporal displacement algorithms, a pattern emerges." Admiral Corvex leaned forward, his 4 primary arms folding in an expression of skeptical attention. "What kind of pattern?" "One that shouldn't exist," Yexil replied, highlighting specific trajectory clusters on her display. "The humans are positioning their refugee ships at precisely calculated intervals throughout a spherical volume of space roughly 15 light-years in diameter. The positioning follows a mathematical progression that accounts for stellar mechanics, gravitational influences, and something else I haven't been able to identify yet." Commander Vexstar's features shifted to display the Nexari equivalent of a frown. "You're suggesting their evacuation isn't random, that it follows some kind of strategic plan?" "I'm suggesting," Yexil said carefully, "that if this were intentional, it would represent a level of computational sophistication that exceeds our current understanding of human capabilities by several orders of magnitude." The briefing room fell silent except for the ambient hum of life support systems and the occasional click of Admiral Corvex's secondary arms drumming against his command chair. The idea that humanity's apparent panic flight might actually be calculated strategy was so fundamentally at odds with everything they'd observed that it seemed easier to assume Lieutenant Yexil had made an error in her analysis. General Thys broke the silence with his characteristic directness. "Run the calculations again. Check for computational errors, data corruption, anything that might explain this apparent correlation." Over the following 18 hours, Yexil's analysis was verified by 3 independent Nexari mathematical teams, cross-referenced by Vorthak tactical computers, and subjected to Grenderite probability assessment. Each review confirmed the same impossible conclusion. Humanity's evacuation was following a pattern so complex that it required predictive modeling of gravitational interactions across multiple star systems, accounting for variables that most species didn't even bother tracking. But the pattern became truly disturbing when Lieutenant Yexil overlaid it with the Devourer fleet's projected approach vector. "This is impossible," she announced to an emergency session of the Coalition Command Council, her harmonic resonance now distinctly agitated. "According to my calculations, the human evacuation positions are optimized for maximum dispersal efficiency, given the Devourer's consumption patterns. They're not just running away randomly, they're positioning themselves to maximize the energy expenditure required for complete species eradication." Admiral Corvex had stared at the projection for several minutes before speaking. "You're telling us that humanity somehow calculated the optimal survival positions for their entire species based on predictive modeling of an enemy force that they've never encountered before?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Yexil confirmed. "But it gets worse. The positioning algorithm appears to incorporate variables that we haven't shared with them, gravitational resonance patterns, stellar drift calculations, even quantum fluctuation predictions that are classified at levels above their security clearance." Commander Vexstar's translucent features had cycled through several expressions before settling on something resembling existential confusion. "How could they know information they don't have access to?" "They couldn't," General Thys growled, his massive form radiating the sort of tension that preceded either violence or deep philosophical contemplation. Unless what?" Admiral Corvex demanded. "Unless they calculated it themselves," Thys finished quietly. "All of it. Every variable we've been tracking, Every predictive model we've been using, every piece of strategic intelligence we've accumulated over centuries of galactic warfare, they figured it out from first principles in less than a week. The implications were staggering. If Lieutenant Yexil's analysis was correct, then humanity hadn't just developed an evacuation plan, they'd essentially reverse-engineered the Coalition's entire understanding of the Devourer threat using nothing but observational data and computational modeling. It suggested a level of analytical capability that bordered on prescient, wrapped in a species-wide operational capacity that could coordinate billions of individuals across interstellar distances without apparent central command structure. There's something else, Yexil added, her harmonic resonance now barely audible, with what appeared to be either awe or terror. The evacuation isn't complete yet. According to the pattern progression, they're still moving people into position, but the mathematical model suggests they're not just optimizing for survival. What do you mean? Commander Vextar asked, though his expression suggested he wasn't certain he wanted to know the answer. I mean, Yexil replied, that the positioning algorithm has secondary and tertiary objectives built into it. Survival is just the first layer. There are additional patterns emerging that serve purposes I haven't been able to determine yet. Admiral Corvex had stood slowly, his forearms spreading in a gesture that conveyed either amazement or the prelude to violence. Are you suggesting that humanity's evacuation is actually some kind of military strategy disguised as a retreat? I'm not suggesting anything, Lieutenant Yexil replied carefully. I'm simply reporting that their chaotic evacuation follows mathematical principles so sophisticated that our best strategic computers can't fully model them. Whether that's intentional or the most statistically improbable coincidence in galactic history is above my analytical pay grade. But even as she spoke, additional reports were filtering in from Coalition monitoring stations throughout human space. The evacuation was accelerating, but more importantly, it was becoming increasingly obvious that every human vessel movement was part of some larger choreography. Ships that had appeared to be fleeing randomly were making course corrections that positioned them with mathematical precision relative to other evacuation groups. Supply convoys were distributing resources according to algorithms that optimized not just for survival, but for sustained operational capacity across impossible distances. And somewhere in the middle of this cosmic ballet, their original representative remained completely absent from all Coalition communications, presumably coordinating the most elaborate strategic deception in military history, while maintaining the perfect illusion of species-wide cowardice. The galaxy's finest military minds were beginning to suspect they'd been played by a species they'd dismissed as primitive, and the realization was both humbling and absolutely terrifying. The Devourer fleet arrived precisely on schedule, because cosmic horrors are nothing if not punctual. 14 days after the human representative had walked out of the Coalition's strategic briefing, the biomechanical monstrosities emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Coalition territory, like a malignant constellation of teeth, tentacles, and barely contained hunger. Their approach had been monitored by every sensor array in 3 sectors, tracked with the sort of grim precision usually reserved for calculating one's own funeral expenses. Admiral Corvex had established his command position in the outer system, coordinating what was optimistically called a tactical withdrawal, but looked suspiciously like several hundred warships, trying very hard not to be in the same solar system as an approaching apocalypse. The Coalition's defensive strategy relied heavily on the time-honored military principle of let someone else figure it out, with humanity serving as the designated someone else through no fault of their own, except spectacularly poor timing in joining the galactic community. The Devourers moved through space with the methodical efficiency of a cosmic food processor, consuming everything organic they encountered and incorporating the biomass into their ever-expanding fleet structure. It was a process that had eliminated 17 civilizations across 4 galactic arms, and there was no particular reason to expect humanity to fare any better than species with actual military capability, which made it particularly surprising when the Devourer fleet began experiencing what could charitably be described as navigational difficulties. "Sir," reported Lieutenant Commander Hixis from the Vorthak monitoring station, "the Devourer advance elements are..." Hesitate. Admiral Corvex turned his primary attention to the tactical displays, his forearms moving in patterns that indicated either deep concentration or impending cardiac arrest. The biomechanical swarm had reached Earth's solar system, and was proceeding according to their established consumption pattern, systematically devouring everything in their path. But their movement through the system was slower than predicted, their formation less cohesive than previous engagements had suggested, Define hesitating, he ordered. They're encountering resistance, not military resistance. They're finding traces of human presence throughout the system, but the signatures are dispersed across impossible distances. Their consumption protocols are designed for concentrated biomass, not widely scattered targets. Commander Vextar's translucent features shifted to display something resembling comprehension, mixed with horror. The evacuation pattern, Lieutenant Yixil's analysis. They positioned themselves to maximize consumption energy expenditure. That's not the impressive part, Hixis continued, his voice carrying an undertone that suggested either admiration or existential dread. The impressive part is that they're doing it across 17 star systems simultaneously. The tactical display updated to show the scope of what humanity had accomplished during their chaotic retreat. Every system within 15 light-years of Earth was experiencing the same phenomenon. Devourer forces were encountering scattered human populations that required individual attention, rather than their preferred mass consumption technique. The biomechanical swarm was essentially being forced to play the galaxy's most elaborate and resource-intensive game of hide-and-seek across multiple star systems. It's magnificent, Lieutenant Yixil announced from her analysis station, her harmonic resonance vibrating with something approaching religious awe. They've weaponized their own dispersal. Every evacuation group is positioned to force maximum energy expenditure from the Devourers, while maintaining perfect communication networks for coordination. But the true genius of humanity's strategy became apparent when the scattered refugee groups began to move. What had appeared to be panicked flight transformed in a matter of hours into the most sophisticated military maneuver ever attempted. Human vessels that had been positioned at apparently random locations throughout local space suddenly revealed themselves to be elements of a three-dimensional formation that spanned multiple star systems. The evacuation had been a deployment, with each refugee ship serving as both sanctuary and tactical element in an operational plan that treated interstellar space like a single battlefield. Admiral Korvex watched in stunned silence as humanity's true capabilities unfolded across his tactical displays, their primitive fusion drives dismissed as hopelessly inadequate for military operations, provided perfect maneuverability for microgravity engagement. Their outdated projectile weapons, marked as technological anachronisms, proved devastatingly effective against biomechanical targets that had evolved to resist energy-based attacks. Most importantly, their apparent lack of central command structure was actually a distributed intelligence network that could coordinate operations across distances that would cripple conventional military hierarchies. They're not retreating, General Thiss observed with the sort of quiet amazement usually reserved for witnessing natural phenomena of cosmic significance. They never were retreating. This is an attack formation. The scattered human vessels began implementing tactics that had never appeared in any galactic military manual, primarily because no other species had ever been desperate enough to attempt them. They used gravitational slingshot maneuvers to achieve impossible acceleration curves. They coordinated attacks across light-year distances, using communication methods that shouldn't have worked according to known physics. Most impressively, they turned their own civilian population into the most effective military asset in galactic history, with refugee ships serving simultaneously as supply depots, command centers, and mobile weapons platforms. The Devourer fleet, faced with an enemy that refused to behave according to established biological imperatives, began experiencing something resembling confusion. Their consumption algorithms had been optimized over millions of years to process concentrated organic matter, not pursue individual targets across interstellar distances, while being harassed by primitive projectile weapons and coordinated gravity-based attacks. Sir, Lieutenant Commander Hixis reported, his voice carrying an undertone of disbelief, the Devourers are withdrawing. Impossible, Admiral Korvex replied automatically, then paused as the tactical displays confirmed the impossible. The biomechanical swarm was indeed pulling back from their assault on human space, their formation showing signs of something that looked suspiciously like strategic retreat. Not withdrawing, Commander Vextar corrected, his mathematical mind processing the implications. Regroup. They're trying to consolidate their forces to deal with distributed resistance, but humanity's positioning makes consolidation impossible without abandoning their consumption of other targets. The full scope of humanity's strategy crystallized in that moment, like a mathematical proof reaching its inevitable conclusion. They hadn't just survived the Devourer assault, they'd made themselves so expensive to eliminate completely
that the swarm was being forced to choose between consuming humanity and consuming everything else. And since the Devourers operated on efficiency algorithms, refined over eons of galactic predation, they were making the only logical choice available. They were moving on to easier target. Brilliant, Lieutenant Yixil whispered, her harmonic resonance barely audible with pure professional appreciation. They've made their own extinction economically inefficient. Admiral Korvex found himself staring at the tactical displays, with the sort of expression typically reserved for contemplating infinity, or trying to understand necessary humor. Humanity had accomplished something that 17 advanced civilizations, with superior technology and centuries of military experience, had failed to achieve. They'd made the Devourer fleet decide they weren't worth the trouble, and somewhere in the vast network of scattered refugee ships and hidden command centers, their original representative was presumably coordinating the defense of her species, with the same quiet efficiency she'd displayed when walking out of the Coalition's strategic brief. The woman they'd dismissed as a cowardly logistics coordinator had just orchestrated the most sophisticated military victory in galactic history, using nothing but math determination and an apparently inexhaustible capacity for making difficult things look easy. The galaxy's finest military minds sat in contemplative silence, gradually coming to terms with the fact that they'd just witnessed a masterclass in strategic thinking from a species they'd assumed barely qualified as sentient. It was humbling, educational, and absolutely terrifying in its implications for future diplomatic relations. After all, if humans could do this when they were trying to run away, what might they accomplish when they decided to stand and fight?